Okay. Welcome everybody to our, I think it's our 11th meeting here for Society of the Spectacle. And we've been going through the book, and we got a little more than halfway through the book. And we've been taking a 2-session break to watch Guy Debord's film of his book. Our last meeting, we watched the first half of the film. And this meeting, we're going to watch the second half. It's about 40 minutes each. And mostly, we'll just watch the film for maybe 15 or 20 minutes. I'll kind of see if we get to a good breaking point, and then stop and we can have discussion, and then we can come back and see the rest of the film. Just a few things about the film. For those of you who, I think most of you will have seen the first half, whether you're in person now or looking at it in Zoom before. But just to clarify, Debord wrote his book in 1967, and he made this film in 1973 when he met a guy who would finance it and give him free reign there. And so in this film, Debord is himself the narrator, and he's reading excerpts from the book. And meanwhile, images are going on that in some cases have something to do with what he's reading. In other cases, they kind of clash, or there are interesting things that are going on there. And then occasionally there are other sound things like clips from other films or silent words on the screen or something like that. But whenever he's reading from the book. So there are just a few things here that I'll mention coming up. The first half of the film, admit these people. Went through some sort of generalities about the spectacle, and there was a few things about Marx and Hegel and stuff like that, but we hadn't really got to the historical parts very much. And this second half of the film, the film is a little different than the book in its sequences. The second half of the film is mostly post-war modern revolt. There's a few things, I mean, there's obviously all these things are connected, but it has, at the end of the first half, Debord had gone through Bolshevism, and he'd gone through Marx and anarchists and Spanish Revolution, things like that. Bolshevism, Stalinism. And then, of course, in that same period, like between World War I and World War II, there was fascism. And the sort of where he was getting at the end of that first half was that this old revolutionary movement with Marx and Bakunin and all this sort of thing, the Paris Commune and the development of the Soviets in Russia and so on, workers' councils, that movement was defeated, which happened, defeated in Russia by the Bolsheviks sort of doing a counter-revolution, and defeated in Spain by the fascists, along with the Stalinists and so on, and also defeated by, sort of a little more gently, by reformism. You had things like Roosevelt's New Deal and stuff like that, that sort of, bought off. Some of these revolts were crushed. physically, and some of them were just sort of co-opted in various ways. So what we're going to get into in this second half, there's a little bit about the urban geography, stuff like that. And then there will be things that are illustrating that interim period, sort of what people call the midnight of the century, where everything's been defeated. You've got Stalinism, fascism, World War II. I mean, it's just this big nightmare, you know, like all the hopes of the early part of the century that have just been crushed. And you're after World War II, at least that's over, but people are still just sort of, wow, what did we go through here? And so Debord has a few things in his film that sort of symbolize or exemplify that. And then he comes in and kind of presents a situationist thing, and you're leading into May 68, which there is a lot of footage of. So there are many minutes of, probably 10 minutes of the film has May 68 stuff in it, along with a few other things like the revolt in Poland in 1970 and so on. And then it goes on from there. So the examples of the defeat of Spain is taken from a film of For Whom the Bell Tolls. And, you know, then we'll see concentration camp and so on like this. There's kind of a beautiful moment that to me, it's my favorite part of the film. It's just where he's silent for a little bit, and you're just seeing, here are the Nazis, here's Franco, you know, in Spain. Here is, you know, a concentration camp. And then kind of going a little after World War II, and you see a big traffic in Paris where at Étoile, which is this big kind of roundabout where cars are going around in a circle, and that segues into a children's carousel, which is going around in the same counterclockwise direction with just a little girl playing alone in the middle of this sort of bleak suburb. And that, I mean, it's just, you know, he doesn't say what that's supposed to be, but it's like, I think it's beautiful. And then that leads into what's coming later. So I think that we can, without further ado, go right into that. This film is, as I said, Debord is narrating it in the original, speaking French, of course. So this film is based on my translation with a woman reading Debord's part. So it makes a little, the guy who did that thought that might give a little different slant on it. So I will now start sharing this. And Kim, just let me know if there's any problem, you know, like if anyone's finding they can't hear something or whatever.
Okay.
So let's share. I'm going to just move it back a little bit. So this is where we just ended last time.
My own imagination has a ghastly familiarity, like a half-remembered dream. Anything could happen here, any moment.
The time of production, commodified time, is an infinite accumulation of equivalent intervals. It is irreversible time made abstract, in which each segment need only demonstrate by the clock its purely quantitative equality with all the others. It has no reality apart from its exchangeability. This general time of human non-development also has a complementary aspect, a consumable form of time based on the present mode of production and presenting itself in everyday life as a pseudo-cyclical time. Pseudo-cyclical time is associated with the consumption of modern economic survival, the augmented survival in which everyday experience is cut off from decision-making and subjected no longer to the natural order but to the pseudo-nature created by alienated labor. It is thus quite natural that it echoes the old cyclical rhythm that governed survival in pre-industrial societies, incorporating the natural vestiges of cyclical time while generating new variants. Day and night, work and weekend, periodic vacations. Consumable pseudo-cyclical time is spectacular time, both in the narrow sense as time spent consuming images and in the broader sense as image of the consumption of time. The time spent consuming images which in turn serve to publicize all the other commodities, is both the particular terrain where the spectacle's mechanisms are most fully implemented and the general goal that those mechanisms present, the focus and epitome of all particular consumptions. As for the social image of the consumption of time, it is exclusively dominated by leisure time and vacations, moments portrayed like all spectacular commodities at a distance and as desirable by definition. These commodified moments are explicitly presented as moments of real life, whose cyclical return we are supposed to look forward to. But all that is really happening is that the spectacle is displaying and reproducing itself at a higher level of intensity. What is presented as true life turns out to be merely a more truly spectacular life. While the consumption of cyclical time in ancient societies was consistent with the real labor of those societies, the pseudo-cyclical consumption of developed economies contradicts the abstract, irreversible time implicit in their system of production. Cyclical time was the really lived time of unchanging illusions. Spectacular time is the illusory lived time of a constantly changing reality. The production process's constant innovations are not echoed in consumption, which presents nothing but an expanded repetition of the past. Because dead labor continues to dominate living labor, in spectacular time the past continues to dominate the present. The lack of general historical life also means that individual life as yet has no history. The pseudo-events that vie for attention in spectacular dramatizations have not been lived by those who are informed about them, and in any case they are soon forgotten due to their increasingly frenetic replacement at every pulsation of the spectacular machinery. Conversely, what is really lived has no relation to the society's official version of irreversible time, and conflicts with the pseudo-cyclical rhythm of that time's consumable byproducts. This individual experience of a disconnected everyday life remains without language, without concepts, and without critical access to its own past, which has nowhere been recorded, uncommunicated, misunderstood, and forgotten. It is smothered by the spectacle's false memory of the unmemorable.
That's the way it goes. Lose one, find one. Play something for me, Mr. Guitar.
Anything special?
Just put a lot of love in it.
He ain't gonna play so good all stretched out on that crap table.
What's eating the fancy man?
I don't know. What's your trouble, kid?
I'm in no trouble. He is. Fooling with a strange woman can bring a man a lot of grief.
You a strange woman?
Only to strangers.
What's going on with you two?
Just what you see, friend.
Oh, you picked the wrong place to come to, mister.
The lady sent for me, not you.
Heads, I'm gonna kill you, mister. Tails, you can play her a tune.
Play me a tune. Play something else.
The spectacle, considered as the reigning society's method for paralyzing history and memory, and for suppressing any history based on historical time, represents a false consciousness of time. Behind the fashions that come and go on the frivolous surface of the spectacle of pseudo-cyclical time, the grand style of an era can always be found in what is governed by the secret yet obvious necessity for revolution.
This is my very best friend, Omar, Miss Poppy Smith.
And you? Are you an Egyptian comprador?
No, I'm a doctor, Dr. Omar of Shanghai and Gomorrah.
Any relation to the poet Omar? A book of verses underneath the brow?
A loaf of bread, a jug of wine, and thou beside me singing in the wilderness.
You said Dr. Omar. Doctor of what?
Doctor of nothing, Miss Smith. It sounds important and hurts no one, unlike most doctors.
And your burnous, is it as real as your title? Where were you born?
My birth took place under a full moon on the sands near Damascus. My father was an Armenian tobacco dealer and was far away. And my mother, the less said about her, the better. She was half French, and the other half is lost in the dust of time. In short, I'm a thoroughbred mongrel. I'm related to all the earth, and nothing that's human is foreign to me.
Then perhaps you can explain how our friend suddenly vanished.
We were alone since I first saw you.
Examining history amounts to examining the nature of power. Greece was the moment when power and changes in power were first debated and understood. It was a democracy of the masters of society, a total contrast to the despotic state where power settles accounts only with itself, within the impenetrable obscurity of its inner sanctum, by means of palace revolutions which are beyond the pale of discussion whether they fail or succeed. The dry, unexplained chronology that a deified authority offered to its subjects, who were supposed to accept it as the earthly fulfillment of mythic commandments, was destined to be transcended and transformed into conscious history. But for this to happen, sizable groups of people had to have experienced real participation in history. Out of this practical communication between those who have recognized each other as possessors of a unique present, who have experienced a qualitative richness of events in their own activity, and who are at home in their own era, arises the general language of historical communication. Those for whom irreversible time truly exists discover in it both the memorable and the threat of oblivion. Herodotus of Halicarnassus here presents the result of his researches, so that time will not abolish the deeds of men.
Bonsoir, York. Bonsoir, mon général. Si nous prenions un peu de café.
Be prepared to remain all winter. All next winter, if necessary.
I waited a long time for that order, sir. Which, of course, I didn't hear.
Of course you didn't hear. If you fail, I assure you the members of your court-martial will be the men who rode with us down the Shenandoah. I'll hand-pick them myself.
Shenandoah.
I wonder what history will say about Shenandoah.
The victory of the bourgeoisie is the victory of a profoundly historical time, because it is the time corresponding to an economic production that continuously transforms society from top to bottom. So long as agrarian production remains the predominant form of labor, the cyclical time that remains at the base of society reinforces the joint forces of tradition, which tend to hold back any historical movement. But the irreversible time of the bourgeois economy eradicates those vestiges throughout the world. History, which until then had seemed to involve only the actions of individual members of the ruling class, and which had thus been recorded as a mere chronology of events, is now understood as a general movement, a relentless movement that crushes any individual in its path. By discovering its basis in political economy, history becomes aware of what had previously been unconscious. But this basis remains unconscious because it cannot be brought to light. This blind prehistory, this new fate that no one controls, is the only thing that the commodity economy has democratized. The bourgeoisie has thus made irreversible historical time known and has imposed it on society, but it has prevented society from using it. Once there was history, but not anymore, because the class of owners of the economy, which is inextricably tied to economic history, must repress every other irreversible use of time because it is directly threatened by them. The ruling class, made up of specialists in the possession of things, who are themselves therefore possessed by things, is forced to link its fate with the preservation of this reified history, that is, with the preservation of a new immobility within history. Meanwhile, the worker at the base of society is for the first time not materially estranged from history, because the irreversible movement is now generated from that base. By demanding to live the historical time that it produces, the proletariat discovers the simple, unforgettable core of its revolutionary project, and each previously defeated attempt to carry out this project represents a possible point of departure for a new historical life. With the development of capitalism, irreversible time has become globally unified. Universal history becomes a reality because the entire world is brought under the sway of this time's development. But this history, that is everywhere simultaneously the same, is as yet nothing but an intra-historical rejection of history. What appears the world over as the same day is merely the time of economic production, time cut up into equal abstract fragments. This unified irreversible time belongs to the global market, and thus also to the global spectacle. The irreversible time of production is first of all the measure of commodities. The time officially recognized throughout the world as the general time of society actually only reflects the specialized interests that constitute it, and thus is merely one particular type of time. The class struggles of the long era of revolutions initiated by the rise of the bourgeoisie have developed in tandem with the dialectical thought of history, the thought which is no longer content to seek the meaning of what exists, but which strives to comprehend the dissolution of what exists, and in the process breaks down every separation. This historical thought is still a consciousness that always arrives too late, a consciousness that can only formulate retrospective justifications of what has already happened. It has thus gone beyond separation only in thought. Hegel's paradoxical stance, his subordination of the meaning of all reality to its historical culmination, while at the same time proclaiming that his own system represents that culmination, flows from the simple fact that this thinker of the bourgeois revolutions of the 17th and 18th centuries sought in his philosophy only a reconciliation with the results of those revolutions.
Вставай, проклятьем заклейменный, весь мир голодных и рабов, явился сразу возмущенный, сердце бой вести готов. Это есть наш последний жизненный бой.
When the proletariat demonstrates through its own actions that this historical thought has not been forgotten, its refutation of that thought's conclusion is, at the same time, a confirmation of its method. The weakness of Marx's theory is naturally linked to the weakness of the revolutionary struggle of the proletariat of his time. The German working class failed to inaugurate a permanent revolution in 1848. The Paris Commune was defeated in isolation. As a result, revolutionary theory could not yet be fully realized. The theoretical shortcomings of the scientific defense of proletarian revolution, both in its content and in its form of exposition, all ultimately result from identifying the proletariat with the bourgeoisie with respect to the revolutionary seizure of power.
Engel Golds? From Jordan? Yes, read it. What? Too late, Duval. That means we're done for. This time we failed. Too bad. Yes. Too bad.
The only two classes that really correspond to Marx's theory, the two pure classes that the entire analysis of capital brings to the fore, are the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. These are also the only two revolutionary classes in history, but operating under very different conditions. The bourgeois revolution is done. The proletarian revolution is a yet unrealized project, born on the foundation of the earlier revolution, but differing from it qualitatively. If one overlooks the originality of the historical role of the bourgeoisie, one also tends to overlook the specific originality of the proletarian project, which can achieve nothing unless it carries its own banners and recognizes the immensity of its own tasks. The bourgeoisie came to power because it was the class of the developing economy. The proletariat cannot create its own new form of power except by becoming the class of consciousness. The growth of productive forces will not in itself guarantee the emergence of such a power, not even indirectly by way of the increasing dispossession which that growth entails. Nor can a Jacobin-style seizure of the state be a means to this end. The The proletariat cannot make use of any ideology designed to disguise its partial goals as general goals, because the proletariat cannot preserve any partial reality that is truly its own. This ideologically alienated theory was then no longer able to recognize the practical verifications of the unitary historical thought it had betrayed when such verifications emerged in spontaneous working-class struggles. Instead, it contributed toward repressing every manifestation and memory of them. Yet those historical forms that took shape in struggle were precisely the practical terrain that was needed in order to validate the theory. They were what the theory needed, yet that need had not been formulated theoretically. The Soviet, for example, was not a theoretical discovery, and the most advanced theoretical truth of the International Workingmen's Association was its own existence in practice. The historical moment when Bolshevism triumphed for itself in Russia and social democracy fought victoriously for the old world marks the inauguration of the state of affairs that is at the heart of the modern spectacle's domination. The representation of the working class has become an enemy of the working class. The Stalin era revealed the bureaucracy's ultimate function, continuing the reign of the economy by preserving the essence of market society, commodified labor. It also demonstrated the independence of the economy. The economy has come to dominate society so completely that it has proved capable of recreating the class domination it needs for its own continued operation. That is, the bourgeoisie has created an independent power that is capable of maintaining itself, even without a bourgeoisie. The totalitarian bureaucracy was not the last owning class in history in Bruno Rizzi's sense. It was merely a substitute ruling class for the commodity economy. A tottering capitalist property system was replaced by a cruder version of itself, simplified, less diversified, and concentrated as the collective property of the bureaucratic class. This underdeveloped type of ruling class is also a reflection of economic underdevelopment. It has no agenda beyond overcoming this underdevelopment in certain regions of the world. The hierarchical and statist framework for this crude remake of the capitalist ruling class was provided by the Working Class Party, which was itself modeled on the hierarchical separations of bourgeois organizations. The ruling totalitarian ideological class is the ruler of a world turned upside down. The more powerful the class, the more it claims not to exist, and its power is employed above all to enforce this claim. It is modest only on this one point, however, because this officially non-existent bureaucracy simultaneously attributes the crowning achievements of history to its own infallible leadership. Though its existence is everywhere in evidence, the bureaucracy must be invisible as a class. As a result, all social life becomes insane. The social organization of total falsehood stems from this fundamental contradiction. Stalinism was also a reign of terror within the bureaucratic class. The terrorism on which this class's power was based inevitably came to strike the class itself, because this class had no juridical legitimacy, no legally recognized status as an owning class that could be extended to each of its members. Its ownership had to be masked because it was based on false consciousness. This false consciousness can maintain its total power only by means of a total reign of terror in which all real motives are ultimately obscured. The members of the ruling bureaucratic class have the right of ownership over society only collectively, as participants in a fundamental lie. They have to play the role of the proletariat governing a socialist society. They have to be actors faithful to a script of ideological betrayal. Yet they cannot actually participate in this counterfeit entity unless their legitimacy is validated. No bureaucrat can individually assert his right to power, because to prove himself a socialist proletarian, he would have to demonstrate that he was the opposite of a bureaucrat, while to prove himself a bureaucrat is impossible, because the bureaucracy's official line is that there is no bureaucracy. Each bureaucrat is thus totally dependent on the central seal of legitimacy provided by the ruling ideology, which validates the collective participation in its socialist regime of all the bureaucrats it does not liquidate. Although the bureaucrats are collectively empowered to make all social decisions, the cohesion of their own class can be ensured only by the concentration of their terrorist power in a single person. In this person resides the only practical truth of the ruling lie, the power to determine an unchallengeable boundary line which is nevertheless constantly being adjusted. Stalin decides without appeal who is and who is not a member of the ruling bureaucracy, who should be considered a proletarian in power, and who branded a traitor in the pay of Wall Street and the Mikado. The atomized bureaucrats can find their collective legitimacy only in the person of Stalin, the Lord of the world, who thus comes to see himself as the absolute person for whom no superior spirit exists. The Lord of the world recognizes his own nature, omnipresent power, through the destructive violence he exerts against the contrastingly powerless selfhood of his subjects. He is the power that defines the terrain of domination, and he is also the power that ravages that terrain.
Das ist das Lied von der roten Fahne, die den entbrennenden Morgen verkündet, die über Länder und Ozeane aller bedrängten Herzen entzündet. Einmal, nach all den Stürmen, wenn sich die Blutnacht erhellt, rauscht sie von allen Türmen einer eroberten Welt.
Genossen, eine alarmierende Nachricht. Der Deutsche Reichstag steht in Flammen. Noch sind keine Einzelheiten bekannt, aber schon verbreitet der faschistische Rundfunk über alle Sender die Behauptung, Kommunisten hätten den Reichstag angezündet. In Wirklichkeit handelt es sich um eine groß angelegte, ungeheuerliche Provokation der Nazi-Regierung.
Die Versammlung ist aufgelöst.
Der Reichstag brennt! Die Nazis haben Vorwand, den sie brauchen.
Die Versammlung ist aufgelöst.
Sie wollen unsere Partei verbieten. Sie wollen die Stimme der Arbeiterklasse ersticken. Aber das wird ihnen nicht gelingen. Solange es Kommunisten in Deutschland gibt, und es wird sie immer geben, solange wird der Kampf gegen Hitler nicht aufhören. Für den Frieden aller Völker, den Hitlergenossen. Hitler heißt Krieg!
When the proletariat discovers that its own externalized power contributes to the constant reinforcement of capitalist society, no longer only in the form of its alienated labor, but also in the form of the trade union.
Okay. Everybody follow that okay? So I think we'll take,
See. Yes.
yeah. I think we'll take a pause there, just when we're getting at that turning point. So comments or questions about what we've seen so far? You can raise your digital hand, and you can also type in questions in the chat, and Kim will let me know about those. Mike?
Hi. Well, I agree with all this stuff, but I mean, but sometimes there are things that I think that I don't agree with, and one of them was the observation about Hegel. That it's the same observation that Marx makes in his critique of Feuerbach, and that philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it. And of course, Debord is talking about, changing it through revolutionary praxis. But Hegel didn't stop at saying that history stops. History is ended. Hegel's philosophy, his philosophical system.
Debord knew that.
Yeah.
I think books have been written about this, Mike, but I mean.
Oh, okay. Sorry. All right.
I mean, there are books just about Debord and Hegel.
Yeah. Okay.
It doesn't really matter. The general gist, like if you could say, well, Hegel was a little different than that. That's not. It doesn't matter if he was. Debord is just generally presenting Hegel as an exemplifier of.
Well, the reason I bring it up is to not discourage people from dismissing. Oh, Hegel, he was just an idealist.
No, but yeah, I mean, Debord is the part. Debord is leaning on Hegel and Marx, and it's
but what Hegel is doing, it is important. It's not a small point. The important thing about understanding Hegel is that he does say that history continues through objective spirit to move toward the absolute ideal, which is freedom. And for him, because he is an idealist and a Lutheran, he says it's God. That's all I wanted to say. Yeah. I'll shut up now.
Yeah. Okay, no, a legit point, but actually, Debord, just because Debord criticizes somebody does not mean that this is not like a moralistic thing, like, oh, we've dealt with him. Debord, the Society of the Spectacle depends on Hegel and Marx hugely.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree that I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't have said anything. Okay.
No, that's okay. Your point is well taken. Okay, Peter.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of an observation and curious what you think. But when he's showing conflict, revolutionary or otherwise, a lot of it is a kind of a movie, right? He's not actually showing actual conflict. He could have, I think, taken documentaries and shown like actual conflict between fascists and communists, or shown actual war. But I think except for the May 68 stuff, it's mostly just taken from films. And I wonder what he's saying there in terms of our idea of it, kind of the spectacular idea of revolution or conflict, doing that in the movie, right? Except for the May 68 stuff, I was kind of watching. I'm like, I think it's mostly, except for the maybe also like the May Day and Red Square, it's just mostly like what you might imagine kind of movie conflict to be, as opposed to, actual like revolution.
Yeah, what you say, there is a lot of the movie stuff, but actually there are some, I mean, there were pictures of Spain. In Barcelona, you could see with the CNT5 trucks and stuff like this. and there are pictures of concentration camps and so on. But actually, if he was not going to be doing a Hollywood level thing, uh, just showing a documentary is not necessarily the best way to do. If you think about documentaries, a lot of them are not very satisfactory. They just show a lot of stuff, and we say, this is a truck going from here to here, and
Yeah.
so what? It doesn't, yeah. Whereas a film can present something, even if it presents it in a kind of caricatural form. And it's obvious when he's talking about the spectacle, and then you see a movie about the Spanish Civil War or something like that with, famous actors in it or something,
Sure.
Obviously the reality was not like that, but it's like what is the thing? I don't want to say it's a symbol exact. It's more than a symbol, but it's like um, when Brecht has a play, and in the play, the action is not very realistic.
Mm-hmm.
Just say, here's the enemy, and here's the capitalist, and here's this. And the capitalist may even be carrying a sign saying, I'm a capitalist, or something like this.
Sure.
But it actually does convey what's going on.
Sure.
More than
it makes it a little clearer.
So in the film, of course, you can do more than less crude than that, but in a way, you don't, just like Brecht did not want it to look realistic, because he did not want you to be able to identify with a heroic star or something like that. That's part of the problem of most documentaries or so-called radical films, is that you're supposed to be rooting for this side against that side. And in reality, that's like rooting for this football team instead of that football team.
Sure.
It's completely meaningless as far as what you're getting out of it. You're just rooting for the good guys and against the bad guys. And Debord is trying to undercut that in a similar way that Brecht tried to undercut it by presenting, here is our hero. And then the hero is sort of klutzy and doesn't know what he's doing, and then
Sure.
and then the bad guys may seem kind of clever, or so. The idea is that you're definitely not identifying with this. You're kind of distanced from it, and you look at that, and so you're a little more able to understand what Brecht or Debord's message is. So, Eric Nye.
Yes, I keep coming up against his notion of the signifier and the signified, how it produces copy after copy, illusion after illusion, and somehow we're stuck in this miasmic world where like we're in some sort of magic show. I like that translation of the word Maya from the Sanskrit. But what I do agree with him on is that what was I going to say? What I do agree with him on is that there is no archetypal image that capitalism can fall back on. I mean, all of Witcher created the archetypal triangle where all triangles emanate from that single principle, whereas in capitalism, the signifier and the signified aren't emanating from anything. It's just privation, which has no real existence or real being. So, I mean, it comes down to, I guess, well, it might not come to this, but who is the master signifier or whom is the master signifier, in other words, if that makes any sense.
I don't usually use that lingo. It sounds kind of silly to me. I mean, I guess Debord is sort of talking about some of those things you're talking about, but I would caution you again, just like with that previous question that came up, against assuming that one or another image is supposed to be something or other. In a lot of cases, it's intentionally ambiguous. And
Yeah,
in
yeah.
cases, it's intentionally ironic that you're looking at a stupid image that's standing for the proletarian revolution. I mean, look,
Yeah.
if you want to say, like, what is, when he's talking about the proletarian revolution and that it keeps, having problems and so on, it's usually, or it's often accompanied by a cavalry charge or a cowboy and Indian battle or something like,
Yeah, I
which
get
is
it.
completely different sort of thing, and obviously he's not saying that is what it's like.
Yeah, I mean, it
If
doesn't
anything, he's
signify
trying
anything.
to get you away from that, to say it's not like that. What is he
Yeah,
talking
it doesn't
about?
signify anything. I really do get the point. And I also like how he talks about the analogies of time and space, where in artificial time, everything commodified is not running on the right natural rhythm. Or
Yeah.
you could say the the calendar that we're running on, based off of Pope Gregory, is the Julian calendar, the 1260 ratio, whereas there are other calendars in the world that run off different timing sequences that are more lunar based. And calendar, the root etymology of the word comes from account, it means account book, like taxes. So I'll stop there, but I just thought I'd pitch in because I don't want to be, I don't want, I don't want to sit like I'm an idiot.
Okay, thank you. John Salt.
Yes, this kind of harks back to what we were talking about 2 weeks ago during the discussion, and that is the medium of film which he's using. And for me, a real key passage, or a key word really, is illusion. And at one point in the part we saw also, he says, cyclical time was the really lived time of unchanging illusions. Spectacular time is the illusory lived time of a constantly changing reality. So the way I see it, as how you've explained it over time, is that, and what Debord is trying to get to, is that the reality that we partake of is a fraud, it's inverted, it's not life, it's a flimsy veneer, and we're not quite understanding, penetrating it because of the socioeconomic situation, capitalism, etc. So I think once we understand that reality is like a fictional film, and then he takes fictional films as well as real documentary films, and he kind of equates the two. They're both illusory in different ways. And then he projects his texts, which are also explaining how illusory everything is. And I think the whole thing is just wonderfully constructed so that reality and the spectacle and illusory time and traditional cyclical time and our time in the changing world, it all kind of is some kind of veneer that's fake. And the way he intersperses this web, I find, is to equate everything. It's not to disentangle it. It's to allow for the whole and then realize how it's just this like cascading snowball over our realities.
Thank you. Kim.
Yeah, we're talking about how the images go with the text, and that's a really interesting. This film forces you to deal with that, because sometimes the images correspond to the text, like there were the pictures of Stalin and they were talking about Stalin, but other times you're trying to figure out how does the image go together with the text. And I was looking through some of the entries from an earlier film in this book, Complete Cinematic Works. And there's a film he did, I've never seen it, it's Critique of Separation. So he keeps talking, or he occasionally mentions separation. So I started thinking about that in terms of how the film's put together, because some of the images are separated from the text. You're trying to figure out how they go together. But in this earlier film, Critique of Separation, there's a clause that says, it is necessary to destroy memory in art, to undermine the conventions of its communication, to demoralize its fans. What a task. As in a blurry, drunken vision, the memory and language of the film fade out simultaneously. At the extreme, miserable subjectivity is reversed into a certain sort of objectivity, a documentation of the conditions of non-communication. So these might apply to the film we're watching. Another, just one last sentence. This is a film that interrupts itself and does not come to an end. Now that's the earlier film, The Critique of Separation. But as I'm watching this, I'm thinking, yeah, the images and the text are separated. There's a separation going on within the technique of putting the film together.
Yeah, very good questions and comments here. I think, Ed?
Yeah, I don't know much about this, but I'm wondering how far this is from deconstructionism, or is this part of deconstructionism?
No.
Did he? So how is it? Because I thought of deconstructionism as that it's all created by the way we think about things, and that what we take as reality is all constructed and mediated by our concepts, and that's
what is called deconstructionist, just like postmodernist, is, in my view and Debord's view, mostly just bullshit with a capital B and a capital S.
Okay.
And people think, oh, the situationists are some kind of deconstructionists or post, because some of the lingo is the same. A lot of these people are also French intellectuals or something, and they're using, like with that thing somebody was bringing up, the signifier and the signified and the blah blah blah. There's a lot of stuff that sort of sounds like it's talking about the spectacle, and in a way it is, but it's talking about the spectacle or about our lives in a sort of ideological way, which this, like, I don't want to go into this too much, except just to say that some of that stuff is in the air, and it has been for decades. And the actual situationists and people like me who were in that have had zero to do with that. And in most cases, just like the situationists had a great contempt for Sartre, we have contempt for these other more recent people who, from a superficial angle, might say, oh, they're radical intellectuals, they're, for revolution and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, but it's just, anyway.
So you haven't, is there an opinion of Foucault? Is there an opinion?
Negative.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a book this woman in Britain wrote a book called The Situationists in a Postmodern Age or something like that. And I don't know.
Ask you what they think of us, but I guess.
Anyway, this stuff goes back 40 or 50 years. This is like, and people in France, books have been written by situationist type people denouncing that whole category of stuff. Foucault, Baudrillard, you name it.
It was kind of a leftist mind capture as I saw it.
Yeah,
Give them something to do and get them off the streets. Well, anyway.
Okay, so I think I'm going to continue here so that we can finish the film, and then we'll see how that goes. So back to sharing where we left off.
Thank you.
Before we do that, I want to mute everybody again. Okay, share.
When the proletariat discovers that its own externalized power contributes to the constant reinforcement of capitalist society, no longer only in the form of its alienated labor, but also in the form of the trade unions, political parties, and state powers that it had created in the effort to liberate itself, it also discovers, through concrete historical experience, that it is the class that must totally oppose all rigidified externalizations and all specializations of power. It bears a revolution that cannot leave anything outside itself, a revolution embodying the permanent domination of the present over the past, and a total critique of separation, and it must discover the appropriate forms of action to carry out this revolution. No quantitative amelioration of its impoverishment, no illusory participation in a hierarchized system can provide a lasting cure for its dissatisfaction, because the proletariat cannot truly recognize itself in any particular wrong it has suffered, nor in the righting of any particular wrong. It cannot recognize itself even in the righting of many such wrongs, but only in the righting of the absolute wrong of being excluded from any real life. New signs of negation are proliferating in the most economically advanced countries. Although these signs are misunderstood and falsified by the spectacle, they are sufficient proof that a new period has begun. We have already seen the failure of the first proletarian assault against capitalism. Now we are witnessing the failure of capitalist abundance. On the one hand, anti-union struggles of Western workers are being repressed first of all by the unions. On the other, rebellious youth are raising new protests, protests which are still vague and confused, but which clearly imply a rejection of art, of everyday life, and of the old specialized politics. These are two sides of a new spontaneous struggle that is, at first, taking on a criminal appearance. They foreshadow a second proletarian assault against class society.
You must remember me.
I never remember pretty women. It's so expensive.
But my Japanese cameras.
I can't help you. Van Straten, has he got a new boat?
This is not about business, Mr. Tadeo. We just want you to do us a favor.
I never do favors.
We only want a little information about Poland.
I never give in. Poland.
As capitalism's ever-intensifying imposition of alienation at all levels makes it increasingly hard for workers to recognize and name their own impoverishment, putting them in the position of having to reject that impoverishment in its totality or not at all, revolutionary organization has had to learn that it can no longer combat alienation by means of alienated forms of struggle. The development of class society to the stage of the spectacular organization of non-life is thus leading the revolutionary project to become visibly what it has always been in essence. Revolutionary theory is now the enemy of all revolutionary ideology, and it knows it.
Michigan, forward! Front, home! Gallop, home! Charge!
No, not a speech. Proposing a toast. In Georgian style, Luigi.
How did you recognize me?
I know you. Your glasses are friends. Logic, cried the dying frog as he started underbearing the scorpion down with him. There is no logic in this. I know, said the scorpion, but I can't help it. It's my character. Let's drink to character.
Right, you Wolverines! West Michigan, charge!
Okay. Questions and comments? Real.
Yes, I totally agree. Let's drink to friendship. Because, you know, at the same time as we live in an economy and with our phones, at the same time as this happening, we have friends. So I would suggest, even if all you do is go have a cup of coffee with your friend, you want to do, everybody here, I'm telling you, man, we've let our friendships go. And that's the only thing that's real in this world, is our friends. Everything else is smoke and mirrors, dude. Even the good books. Debord even is something from the past. But our friends who are still alive, thank them for still being here for you. Because that's the way out of this system is, if anything's ever going to happen that's real, it's going to happen by friends, people who have shown that they're reliable. So be somebody that your friends can count on. And if you know somebody who needs help, for fuck's sake, don't wait till they have to ask, you know? I'm sorry, my camera's on the other. Thank you. That's all I have to
Thank
say.
you. Good points, Rail. Kim, did we have anything? John?
Yes, I also was moved by the part where he talked about his faithful friends. And then we had the two photos, one of Ivan Chiteglov and one of Asker Jorn.
Yeah.
So it was a sweet shout out there. And we think of Debord mostly as intellect, but he had a big heart too, I think. That I get that impression. I would like to just read one paragraph of his from another film, the one that came later, which I think really gives an insight into his technique and what he was thinking about, what he was doing. In girum imus nocte et consumimur igni,
Yes.
also from your book, Ken. In the present film, for example, I am simply stating a few truths over a background of images that are all trivial or false. This film disdains the image scraps of which it is composed. I do not wish to preserve any of the language of this outdated art, except perhaps the reverse shot of the only world it has observed and a tracking shot across the fleeting ideas of an era. I pride myself on having made a film out of whatever rubbish was at hand. And I find it amusing that people will complain about it who have allowed their entire lives to be dominated by every kind of rubbish.
Thank you. Peter.
That's hilarious.
Yeah, it just kind of struck me the interstitial cards that he had, the different quotes from Machiavelli, Clausewitz. I think there was an anarchist in there talking about sabotage. That he's using them as a way to examine kind of real materialist theory as opposed to ideology, and kind of taking not necessarily just from proletarian revolutionaries, but also from bourgeois thinkers, and showing what it is to analyze things in a real way as opposed to an ideological way. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting way to put those cards in there and to kind of hammer his point home.
Yeah, thank you. Eric Nye.
Yes, I think he's absolutely correct in what he is producing and creating. And if I were to sum it up in my own words, he's basically saying that all of us suffer from privation or lack of something. And if it actually had, like i.e., the commodity market actually had real being and real existence, then we'd be able to directly act on it. But unfortunately, it doesn't, because it's not part of my experience. And I'd like to end it with the idea that when Gurdjieff met P.D. Ouspensky, he said to Ouspensky, if you knew what you were writing about and understood it, I'd bow down and have you teach me. That's exactly what the image I got of Debord. So yeah, if this guy knows what he's talking about, I'll actually bow down to him and kiss his feet. Okay, that's it.
Thank you. Kim.
Well, I just wanted to continue to focus on the film, how the film is put together. And it's interesting that there's some images of Debord himself in there. And some of the editing is pretty funny. I mean, the juxtaposition of scenes, like we saw an image of Oskar Jorn and somebody else before him, and then Oskar Jorn, and then it goes back to the Civil War, the U.S. Civil War, and some of these cuts are pretty humorous. So it's not all so, a test to see, if you can figure out everything that's going on.
Yeah, for example, one of the times the images was when he was quoting, the quote was from Shakespeare's Richard III. And Richard III, as some of you may know, but some of you may not, was a British king who was the villain. And he's this hunchbacked guy, but he plots until he can get into power. And right at the beginning of his play, he's saying, because I can't be a lover, I have determined that I'm going to be a spoil sport. He used other language, but kind of like that. I'm going to ruin every. And so for that quotation, Debord is having a picture of himself, which is completely not true. But he's kind of saying, for whatever reasons, I'm going to be a spoil sport for this society. Just like Richard was.
Oh, Ed had written something in the text. Ken, the frame of the girl in the bleak suburbs right after the concentration camps that you mentioned earlier might be related to this quote by Vonnegut, quote, if the Nazis had known contemporary urbanists, they would have transformed their concentration camps into low-income housing, unquote.
I don't think he necessarily was thinking, but obviously he was aware of that because he was aware of Vonneguten's book while he was doing this. So for sure, I mean, that was something that to them was obvious, was that the Nazis concentration camps is just a sort of, just like Stalinism, it's a cruder version. And we live in a much more sophisticated version, where it's more pleasant and, it's kind of hard to get your fingers on. You can't point to, oh, this is bad, because your cell might be almost, real spiffy. I think what I do here for the next few minutes is Debord wrote or created a film after this film in which he responded to critics of this film. And it's a short, and the film itself, you can see it online, but the copy of the film is so crappy that you can hardly see what's going on. And it's got subtitles, and so it's even hard to read the subtitles. So I'm just going to read you part of the narration of this film because he's talking about what he's replying to what people have said about the film. And it was reviewed in newspapers and magazines and all this kind of thing. So he says and the film is like this. It's where he's narrating it and you're seeing various images, which I won't go into. The title is Refutation of All the Judgments, Pro or Con, thus far rendered on the film The Society of the Spectacle. And here he goes. The spectacular organization of the present class society has led to two widely evident consequences. The first is a general deterioration in the quality of both products and rationales. The second is the fact that those who claim to find happiness in this society are obliged to maintain a careful distance from the things they pretend to like, because they invariably lack the intellectual or other means that would enable them to attain a direct, in-depth knowledge of them, or to incorporate them into a coherent practice, or to develop any genuine taste regarding them. These consequences, which are already so evident when it's a matter of housing conditions, cultural consumption, sexual liberation, or the quality of wine, are naturally all the more pronounced when we come to revolutionary theory and the formidable language with which that theory denounces our terminally ill world. It is thus hardly surprising that this combination of naive falsification and ignorant approval, so characteristic of the modern spectacle, is reflected in the diversely uncomprehending responses to the film entitled The Society of the Spectacle. This particular incomprehension is inevitable, and will continue to be so for some time to come. The spectacle is an infirmity more than a conspiracy. Those who write for the newspapers and magazines of our time are not concealing their intelligence. What we see is all they've got. What could they possibly say of any pertinence about a film which attacks their habits and ideas en bloc, and which does so at a time when they themselves are beginning to sense the collapse of every one of them? The stupidity of their reactions stems from the breakdown of their world. Those who claim to like my film have liked too many other things to be capable of liking it. And those who say they don't like it have also accepted too many other things for their judgment to have the slightest significance. The poverty of their discourse reflects the poverty of their lives. You need only to look at their surroundings and their occupations, their commodities and their ceremonies, which are on view everywhere. You need only listen to those imbecilic voices giving you contemptuous hourly updates on the current state of your alienation. Spectators do not find what they desire what they find. The spectacle does not debase people to the point of making them love it, but many are paid to pretend they do. Now that such people can no longer get away with assuring us that this society is completely satisfactory, they hasten to declare themselves dissatisfied with any critique of it. These dissatisfied people all feel they deserved something better. But do they really imagine that anyone is trying to win them over? Do they really believe there is still time for them to rally to such a critique, supposing that they suddenly became convinced of its truth? Do these ill-lodged inhabitants of the land of approbation suppose they can continue to speak without it being noticed where they're speaking from? In a freer and more truthful future, people will look back in amazement at the idea that pen pushers hired by the system of spectacular lies could imagine themselves qualified to offer their smug opinions on the merits and defects of a film that is the negation of the spectacle, as if the dissolution of this system was a matter of opinion. Their system is now being attacked in reality, and it is defending itself by force. Their counterfeit arguments are no longer accepted, which is why so many of these professional agents of falsification are facing the prospect of unemployment. The most stubborn of these endangered liars still pretend to wonder whether the society of the spectacle actually exists, or whether it is perhaps just an imaginary notion that I thought up. But since the woods of history have for the last few years begun to march against their castle of false cards, quoting Macbeth, and are continuing at this very moment to close ranks and move in for the kill, most of these commentators are now fawningly praising the excellence of my book, as if they were capable of reading it, and as if they would have welcomed its publication in 1967 with the same respect. They generally complain, however, that I have abused their indulgence by bringing the book to the screen. The blow is all the more painful because they had never dreamed that such an extravagance was possible. This anger confirms the fact that the appearance of such a critique in a film upsets them even more than in a book. Here, as elsewhere, they are forced into a defensive struggle on a second front. And these are examples. Many complain that the film is hard to understand. Some say that the images prevent them from understanding the words. Sorry, I think that was YouTube picking up. I forgot to. So some complain that the film is hard to understand. Some say that the images prevent them from understanding the words. Others that the words distract from the images. By telling us that they find the film exhausting, and by proudly elevating their individual fatigue into a general criterion of communication, these critics are trying to give the impression that they have no problem understanding, or perhaps even largely agreeing with, the same theory when its exposition is limited to a book. They are attempting to disguise as a disagreement between different conceptions of cinema what is actually a conflict between different conceptions of society and an open war within the existing society. But if my film is so far beyond them, how can we suppose they are any more capable of understanding everything else that falls to their lot in a society that has so thoroughly conditioned them to mental exhaustion? How could such easily fatigued people find themselves in a better position amid the incessant cacophony of so many simultaneous commercial and political messages, to see through the crude sophisms designed to make them accept their work and their leisure, or the wisdom of President Giscard, or the taste of food additives? The difficulty is not in my film, but in their servile minds. No film is more difficult than its era. For example, there are people who understand and others who do not understand that when the French were presented with a new ministry called the Quality of Life Department, this was nothing but an age-old ruling class ploy, designed, as Machiavelli put it, to, quote, allow them to retain at least the name of what they have already lost, unquote. There are people who understand and others who do not understand that the class struggle in Portugal, he's talking about the revolution there of 73 to 75, which is contemporary with this film, has from the very beginning been dominated by a direct confrontation between the revolutionary workers organized in autonomous assemblies and the Stalinist bureaucracy allied with a few defeated generals. Those who understand such things will understand my film. And I don't make films for those who don't understand such things or who make it their business to prevent others from understanding. Though all the reviews come from the same zone of spectacle-generated pollution, they are as apparently varied as any other present-day commodities. Several of the reviewers claimed that my film filled them with enthusiasm, but none of them were able to explain why. Whenever I find myself approved of by those who should be my enemies, I ask myself what error have they made in their reasoning? It's usually easy to find. Faced with an unusual number of innovations and an insolence that is utterly beyond their comprehension, these avant-garde consumers vainly try to rationalize a ground for approval by attributing these fascinating eccentricities to a non-existent individual lyricism of Debord. One of them, for example, admires my film for its supposed, quote, lyricism of rage, unquote. Another discovered by watching it that the passing of a historical epoch produces a certain melancholy. Others, who greatly overestimate the refinements of present-day social life, attribute to me a certain dandyism. These are nothing but different forms of the perennial tactic of all ruling apologetics: deny what exists and explain what does not. A critical theory that accompanies the dissolution of a society does not concern itself with expressing rage, much less with presenting mere images of rage. It seeks to understand, to describe, and to precipitate of movement that is developing before our eyes. While this is going on, the image of the film are from the Portuguese Revolution, by the way. As for those who present us with their own pseudo-rage as a sort of newly fashionable artistic content, it is obvious that this is merely their way of compensating for the spinelessness, compromises, and humiliations of their actual life, which is why spectators so readily identify them. I'm going to skip a couple things he's talking about the Portugal on the left. Okay. And so he's saying, okay, this other critic also regrets that a mind of my quality has limited its expression to a, quote, cinema ghetto, unquote, where the masses will have little chance to see it. This argument does not convince me. I prefer to remain in obscurity with these masses rather than consent to harangue them under the artificial floodlights manipulated by their hypnotizers. Another sophist of similarly limited mental capacity presents a contrary argument. By publicly denouncing the spectacle, am I not therefore entering the spectacle? This sort of purism, which sounds particularly strange coming from a journalist, is obviously invoked in the hope of convincing people that no one should ever appear in the spectacle as an enemy of it. Those who do not have even a subordinate post in spectacular society, and who thus have nothing to lose but their ambitious hope of eventually serving in one of its juvenile relief corps, have given a more frank and furious expression of their discontent and even of their jealousy. So he gives an example of another anonymous individual concludes that it would have been fine to film my book in 1967 when it was written, but that in 1973 it was too late. The reason he gives for this conclusion is that it seems crucial to him that from now on everybody should stop talking about everything of which he himself is ignorant. Marx, Hegel, books in general, because they cannot be an adequate means of liberation, any use of film, because it is merely film, theory above all, and even history itself, which he congratulates himself for having anonymously abandoned. So on. Okay, so he's still talking about this same critic. It's no more contradictory than it is for somebody to pride himself, he's referring to this critic, on having remained anonymously silent since 1968, while admitting that he has not even reached the point of scorning his professors. Our anonymous critic nevertheless has the merit of having illustrated better than others the utter ineptitude of the anti-historical perspective he advocates and the real motivations behind these impotent people's pretended disdain for reality. In postulating that it was too late to undertake a cinematic adaptation of the Society of the Spectacle 6 years after the appearance of the book, he overlooks the fact that there have not been 3 books of social critique of such importance published in the last 100 years. He also fails to consider the fact that I myself had written the book. There is no standard of just comparison for judging whether I was relatively slow or fast in making the film, since it is obvious that the best of my predecessors had no access to the film medium. Everything considered, I must admit that I found it very gratifying to be the first person to carry out this sort of exploit. The defenders of the spectacle will be as slow to recognize this new use of film as they were in recognizing the fact that a new era of revolutionary opposition was undermining their society. But they will be obliged to recognize it just as inevitably, and they will follow the same sequence, first remaining silent, then speaking beside the point. The reviewers of my film have reached the latter stage. The specialists of the cinema have said that my film's revolutionary politics were bad. The left-wing political illusionists have said that it was bad cinema. But when one is both a revolutionary and a filmmaker, it is easy to demonstrate that their shared bitterness stems from the fact that the film in question is a precise critique of the society they do not know how to combat, and the first example of a kind of film they do not know how to make. End.
And
question.
Mike had in the chat, is there a link or do you have a title of what you were reading, or is there a link?
It's in this book, and I'll be linking it
Okay.
in my email that I send out tomorrow. As I said, I was tempted to show that film, but the visual quality is so horrible that you would have just been saying, well, what's going on? And you wouldn't have been able to read the subtitles. So I would have been having to come in. I actually, this way, at least you get the soundtrack for most of it. So I will be sending that to you later. It's the film, it's Debord's fifth film. It's the film that comes right after Society of the Spectacle. It's like a sequel. And it's about 25 minutes long. Eric.
Yes, before I sign off and see you at the next meeting, I think Debord missed the entire point. He was supposed to be waiting. What is he waiting for? He's waiting for his will.
I'm
If
sorry,
you get,
I
if
didn't
you get the
understand
point.
what you're saying.
Oh no, I mean, he just was impatient. He wasn't waiting long enough. What is he waiting for? He's waiting for his will.
Waiting
if you get my
for his
point.
will?
Yeah. My point is Debord is impatient. He wasn't waiting long enough because sooner or later he would realize that he was waiting for his will. W-I-L-L.
What?
If you get my point.
You're waiting to die.
Waiting for his will.
And testament?
No, like
I would say Debord is probably the best person at waiting that I'm aware of.
Waiting for his will to occur?
Yeah, I mean, I'm talking about privation again. What we lack and how what we don't experience has no real being or real existence because we cannot directly act upon it. I mean, if Debord would have waited a little bit longer, he would have come to his conclusions that he was waiting for his will and could have pulled it off by all together in one full stroke. But I guess he missed that. So
I still miss it. I mean, he's waiting to die. What are you?
Waiting for his will, like willpower.
He's waiting to have enough.
Are you kidding? Debord going through, spending his whole life at this thing, doesn't have any willpower.
I'm talking about magical will, the 7 stages of willpower. Goes from ordinary to magical. Because the thing that came to my mind was when you're talking about Segwa, who used to told me in the Situationists when I was watching, he used to transfix cities with his gaze. That's what I mean when I was waiting for Debord and his project to come through. He wasn't waiting long enough. He could have transfixed cities with his gaze. You know what I mean? So that the Situationists in the first discourse.
Well,
first
sorry, I mean, I'm at a loss of what to say.
Yeah.
I have
Honestly,
no
at
idea
that,
what you're
but
talking about.
What's the
yeah,
What's the first discourse?
The Situationist Anthology. Where you're talking about Stegloff,
About
who could transfix cities with his gaze. Yeah.
Yeah, well, okay, Stegloff was a buddy of Debord's back, when they were both young, and he was a visionary and kind of crazy, but somebody who Debord, I mean, at a certain point saying, I'm inspired by this guy. This was a period of for a brief period there where they were companions in this thing. And much, much later, Debord, in his final film, he delivers a eulogy for Stegloff as being this visionary. But that's not saying that Debord was not a visionary or something like this. This has nothing to do with waiting. I mean, one of Debord's theses in Society of the Spectacle, the next to last thesis is you have to know how to wait.
Oh, well, I didn't catch that. I mean, I think his project is left incomplete, and sooner or
Well,
later
of
it will
course
be
it's
completed.
incomplete. He's talking about changing the world.
Yeah, it'll come to completion. I think.
No kidding.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think anyone has to do anything anymore because I mean, it kind of speaks for itself.
Here's the next to last, just part of the next to last thesis of Society of the Spectacle. By rushing into sordid reformist compromises or pseudo-revolutionary collective actions, those driven by an abstract desire for immediate effectiveness are in reality obeying the ruling laws of thought, adopting a perspective that can see nothing but the latest news. In this way, delirium reappears within the camp that claims to be opposing it. A critique seeking to go beyond the spectacle must know how to wait. And then at the end of this film, as you may recall, in one of those texts that appear, he's after going through the May 68 images and all this, he says, we have to recognize, we have to acknowledge that it's going to take several May 68s or several revolutions of that scope, of that to get beyond this society.
Okay, forgive me.
So, and you might say that Portugal was sort of one of them just a few years later. And we've had, maybe in East Europe, especially Poland, a decade or two later, we had another one. And we've had some other interesting things, since. But in no way did Debord ever say, hey, this is easy. Well, why don't we hurry up here? I mean, on the contrary, he's saying, you people who are, we got to go out and do this thing. This may take decades, if it ever happens. He never says it's going to happen. He says it can happen. And in some of his later works, he points out, hey, the ruling society has held together better than we had hoped. And, there's that it's possible that, the planet goes down the tubes before this happens, because of ecological stuff, and which is one of our concerns in these recent decades.
Yes, I suppose I can give you a concrete example of people that overturned a whole empire within a small, short span of time would be someone who has absolute will, which can test the limits, absolutely annihilates matter. And who would that be? Moses, when he realized the I am that I am, the all-inclusive capital I, which severed the deal once and for all and took care of it within a blink of an eye. But I guess maybe Debord isn't thinking along those lines. So,
well,
excuse me if I'm diverting.
I doubt if anybody else here thinks along those lines.
Yeah, sorry if I'm diverging, but yeah, I get his point. Like, what is the point he's trying to make? Like, sounds completely reasonable, and unfortunately, the capitalist state machine puts up a lot of resistance to this kind of talk. So much resistance, I don't know, it might be impossible these days.
Well, that remains to be seen. So
Yeah,
any
yeah.
other comments or questions before we go? We're running over time here. Okay,
Job. I understand much more of it. Thank you.
thank you. Okay, so I'll be sending out an email tomorrow with some of these relevant links and so on that. And our
Thanks,
next
Ken.
meeting will be getting back to the book. But I thought it would be good to have this film in here to kind of give you a little different slant on what we've been talking about, what Debord's been talking about. So thank you very much for your questions and comments. And I'll see you in 2 weeks, and I'll see some of you